37.9 inches of snow in less than 24 hours. Think about that for a second. Think about what that means. Because that number, 37.9 inches, did not just break a record, it obliterated one. It erased a record that had stood in Providence, Rhode Island since 1978. A record that had survived 48 years of nor'easters, coastal storms, Arctic blasts, and every category of winter fury the Atlantic seaboard had thrown at it. A record so deeply embedded in New England weather history that most meteorologists had never seriously entertained the idea of it falling in their careers. And then February of 2026 showed up, and in the span of a single day, it was gone. Not nudged, not barely surpassed, annihilated. That is the story I'm about to walk you through. And I need you to understand, the blizzard of 2026 was not just a bad storm. It was not just a rough weekend. It was the exclamation point on one of the most relentlessly violent winter seasons the northeastern United States has experienced in living memory. And the way it unfolded, from its origins thousands of miles away over the Pacific Ocean, to the moment it parked itself offshore and detonated like a meteorological bomb, is one of the most extraordinary atmospheric events of the decade. Let me take you back to where this all started, because the full picture of what happened in the winter of 2025 into 2026 deserves to be understood from the beginning. Not just the headline blizzard, but the entire season that set the table for it. The 2025 into 2026 winter season arrived with no shortage of warning signs. Forecasters and seasonal outlooks pointed toward an active pattern, particularly for the northeastern United States. La Niña conditions were present, but weakening. Warming Pacific waters were nudging the jet stream into configurations that historically favor repeated storm development along the East Coast. And right on cue, the atmosphere started delivering. Before February ever arrived, Boston had already accumulated 43 and 3 inches of snow, more than 8 inches above its seasonal average, and dramatically more than the 28, 1 inch it had seen at the same point the previous year. New York City's Central Park had already logged 22, 3 inches before the biggest event of the season even got started. Philadelphia had measured 16 inches, double what it had seen by the same date the year before. The season was running hot, hot with cold, hot with fury, and it was building toward something. In late January 2026, the first major event of the season had already announced itself in devastating fashion. A massive winter storm formed off the Pacific coast on January 21st, tracked across the United States, and by January 24th through the 26th, it had put over 300 million people under winter precipitation warnings or advisories. Let me let that number sink in for a moment. 300 million people. That is essentially every person living in the contiguous United States under some form of winter weather warning simultaneously. The storm dumped 1 to 2 feet of snow from Texas to Maine. Nashville, Tennessee, recorded its worst ice storm in decades, with Nashville Electric Service logging the highest number of power outages at any point in its entire history, peaking at 230,000 customers in the dark. Across Tennessee as a whole, more than 250,000 outages were recorded, the highest of any state during the event. A total of 29 fatalities were confirmed by the Tennessee Department of Health. 29 people dead from a winter storm in the south. New Mexico's Bonito Lake recorded 31 inches of snow. Kansas City International Airport set a daily snowfall record on January 24th, breaking a record that had stood since 1956. Wind chills in eastern Iowa plummeted to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The January storm became one of the worst days for aviation in American history, with more than 11,000 flights canceled in a single day, the worst cancellation figure since March 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Total damage from the January storm alone exceeded $4 billion, and then, with communities still digging out, with power crews still working to restore service, with families still counting their losses, the atmosphere reached back and loaded up again. February 20th, 2026. Meteorologists at the Weather Prediction Center had been watching a shortwave trough move onshore on the west coast. At this point, it was just a disturbance on a satellite loop, a ripple in the pattern. Nobody outside the meteorological community was paying much attention, but the models, the American GFS, the European ECMWF, they were picking something up, something significant, a signal. The kind of signal that makes experienced forecasters lean toward their screens and start asking each other, quietly, whether they are reading this right. Because what the models were showing was not just a nor'easter. What the models were showing was a rapid intensification event of rare magnitude heading straight for the most densely populated corridor in the United States. By February 21st, the signals were sharpening. The WPC began highlighting the potential for a coastal storm to develop off the northeastern United States in the February 20th through 23 timeframe. The system tracked eastward across the Rocky Mountains. A new surface low formed off the southeastern United States coast early on February 22nd. And then something extraordinary happened. Something that meteorologists describe with a specific term, one that sounds almost too dramatic to be technical, but that is in fact the most precise descriptor available: bomb cyclone. A bomb cyclone, for those unfamiliar, is defined as a low pressure system that drops in central pressure by at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. The pressure drop triggers a catastrophic acceleration in the storm's winds and precipitation intensity, essentially the meteorological equivalent of a fighter jet going supersonic. Winter storm. Hernando, as the Weather Channel named it, dropped 41 millibars in 24 hours. 41 millibars. Its central pressure bottomed out at 966 millibars, the pressure equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. Not a warm core tropical system, a cold core winter storm sitting off the coast of New England, packing pressure gradients that generated sustained winds capable of felling trees and power lines across 5 states simultaneously. The blizzard warnings went up on February 22nd. For New York City, it was the first blizzard warning in 9 years. For New Jersey, all 21 of its counties simultaneously under a blizzard warning, it was the first time that had happened since January 1996. For tens of millions of people watching the forecast updates in real time, there was a specific quality to this one that felt different from the routine winter storm advisories they had grown accustomed to dismissing. Because the numbers on the forecast maps were not 6 to 8 inches. They were not 10 to 14 inches. They were 20 to 30 inches, 2 feet of snow, being forecast in specific, confident terms for cities with tens of millions of residents, for cities with millions of cars on the road, for cities where 2 feet of snow is not just an inconvenience. It is a full operational collapse of every system that makes modern urban life function. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani declared a state of emergency and imposed a citywide travel ban for all non-essential vehicles. That is not a routine action. A citywide travel ban in New York City means shutting down one of the most kinetically relentless urban environments on Earth. Public transit halted, schools closed, not remote learning, a genuine snow day, the first for New York City public school students since 2019. Federal and state courts shut down. Over 800 emergency shovelers were deployed at $30 an hour. 600 snowplows were staged across the 5 boroughs. Rhode Island Governor Dan McKee declared a state of emergency and deployed some 500 snowplows and enormous stockpiles of salt. Emergency shelters opened across the region. And still, despite all of that preparation, despite days of advance warning, despite every resource that could be mobilized being mobilized, the storm came in and simply overwhelmed everything in its path. By the time the worst of Hernando's fury hit metropolitan New York on the night of February 22nd into the morning of the 23rd, snowfall rates along Long Island were reaching 3 inches per hour. 3 inches per hour. That is not a storm you can plow ahead of. By the time a plow clears a block at 3 inches per hour, the block behind it already needs another pass. The snow was dense, wet, and heavy. The worst kind for infrastructure. Trees snapped under the weight. Power lines came down. By the morning of February 23rd, more than 600,000 customers across the region had lost power. More than 600,000 homes and businesses sitting in darkness as temperatures plunged and the wind howled at speeds that, in some coastal areas of New England, were registering near 100 miles per hour. 98 miles per hour was the peak wind gust recorded. Hurricane strength, out of a winter storm, out of a snow system that the models had correctly identified 6 days in advance, and that had still arrived with enough force to shock everyone who watched it. Central Park in New York City recorded 19.7 inches of snow, its 9th largest snowstorm in recorded history dating back to 1869, the 9th largest, in a city with a century and a half of meteorological records. That alone would have been the dominant story on any other winter day. But the storm had not finished yet, because as the center of the bomb cyclone explosively deepened offshore and the heaviest snow bands wrapped northward into New England, Providence, Rhode Island stepped directly into the core of the most intense precipitation machine the eastern seaboard had seen in nearly 5 decades. Providence recorded 37.9 inches of snow in less than 24 hours. By one measurement, other reporting stations in southeastern New England recorded totals approaching that figure. 5 states, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, all reported at least 30 inches of snow from this single storm system. 30 inches in 5 separate states simultaneously. That is not a regional snow event. That is a geographic restructuring of the winter landscape. Providence's February 24th snow depth of 39 inches obliterated the previous record for heaviest snowpack in the city's history, a record of 30 inches that had stood since February 5th, 1961. Snowfall rates at the peak of the storm were reported at 4 inches per hour in parts of Rhode Island. Think about what 4 inches per hour looks like from inside a building. Think about what it looks like from inside a car. Think about what it looks like trying to walk through it. It is white noise. It is complete sensory obliteration. A total whiteout in the most literal possible sense. And the wind. Do not underestimate what the wind did to this storm's impact. The combination of the bomb cyclone's extreme pressure gradient and the heavy, wet snow created a physical loading on every tree, every power line, every roof, every structure in the storm's path that tested the outer limits of what built environments are designed to withstand. Coastal flooding along the Jersey shore caused minor to moderate damage as storm surge driven by hurricane-force winds pushed seawater against infrastructure that had barely recovered from previous flood events. Lightning struck through the snowfall, a phenomenon called thunder snow that occurs only when atmospheric instability is so extreme that the standard rules of storm dynamics no longer seem to apply. And it was not brief, isolated lightning. It was recurring. Thunder rumbling through a blizzard is a sound that people who hear it for the first time genuinely cannot process. The sky is delivering fire and ice simultaneously. The atmosphere is doing something that feels physiologically impossible, and your brain struggles to categorize it. By the time the storm finally moved off into the Atlantic and the last of the snow bands dragged across down East Maine on the morning of February 25th, the records that had fallen numbered in the dozens. Providence's all-time snowstorm record. Block Island's all-time 24-hour snowfall record. Boston's February snowfall total, 42.2 inches for the month, a record February for the city. Newark, New Jersey, logged 27.1 inches, its second biggest snowstorm on record. Atlantic City logged 16.9 inches, their heaviest single storm in more than 15 years. The National Weather Service office in Norton, Massachusetts, investigated several totals in southeastern Massachusetts to determine whether they would qualify as new state calendar day records. The blizzard of 2026 was rated a Category 3 out of 5 on NOAA's Regional Snowfall Index, a rating based on snowfall totals, geographic extent, and affected population. The insured losses from the storm alone were initially estimated between $2 billion and $4 billion, with analysts noting that roof collapse, coastal flooding, and business interruption claims would take weeks to fully develop. 30 deaths were confirmed by early March. 15 in New Jersey, 6 in New York, and others spread across Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. 30 people. Human beings who did not survive a winter storm that the forecasters predicted 6 days in advance. That is the brutal mathematics of extreme weather. Advanced warning saves lives. It saved far more than 30 in a region with over 40 million people in its path. But advanced warning cannot save everyone. There are people who cannot evacuate, people who are stranded, people who get out of their cars for reasons that seem logical in the moment and do not make it back in, people whose buildings fail. The death toll is always, always the most important number in any weather event. And 30 is not an abstraction. 30 is 30 families. And here's the thing about the blizzard of 2026 that I want to leave you with, because I think this is the part that the news coverage did not fully capture. This was not an isolated event. It was not a freak occurrence in an otherwise normal winter. It was the centerpiece of a season that, from January through March of 2026, produced event after event after event. The January storm with its $4 billion in damage and 300 million people under warnings. The blizzard of Hernando in February. And then in mid-March, Winter Storm Iona, a massive extratropical cyclone that buried the upper Midwest and high plains under 3 to 4 feet of snow, became the first storm-rated Category 5 on the Regional Snowfall Index since the January 2016 United States blizzard, and caused at least 500,000 people to lose power across multiple states. 3 historic winter events in less than 2 months. 3 events that would each have been the dominant weather story of any individual season, all compressed into a single 60-day window. This is what it looks like when an active atmospheric pattern and a loaded moisture environment and a persistent jet stream configuration combine during a winter season. It does not give you one big event and then go quiet. It keeps going, it keeps loading up and delivering. And the people in its path, the people in Providence digging out from nearly 4 feet of snow, the people in Nashville still dealing with ice damage weeks after their storm, the people in South Dakota dealing with the March blizzard closing interstate highways, those people are not experiencing statistics. They are experiencing the real, physical, life-disrupting weight of what the atmosphere is capable of when it decides to make history. The blizzard of 2026 made history. The season of 2025 into 2026 made history. And every person who lived through it has a story that starts with a number, 37.9 inches, and ends with something they will not forget as long as they live. Stay informed. Stay prepared. And the next time a forecast model starts showing something that meteorologists are describing quietly, carefully to each other as historic, take it seriously. because this season proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the atmosphere is fully capable of doing exactly what the models say it will do, and then doing it harder.